Have 100 jars filled up with ghee. Now sprinkle the flesh with water. Instantly the hideous ball split into 100 pieces, embryos the size of a finger joint, and one extra. Vyasa took each one, placed it in a jar, and left instructions about the tending of the embryos and when the vessels should be broken open. More months of waiting. In the room of jars, a dozen nurses tended the embryos that slowly grew inside the glowing vessels. One day, Gandhari woke to a loud commotion. The first baby had been born from his jar and was brought to her. Her hands encountered a large, muscular infant, her firstborn son. Ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho-ri-o, ho, ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're tackling, or trying to tackle, or starting to tackle the Mahabharata.
Yes, but if we're tackling it, we definitely lost. It's amazing, but it's strong.
Oh, this is much too valiant a competitor for us to take down. I mean, not that we're actually ever trying to defeat or win or conquer the books that we read.
Well, we never had a chance.
Yeah, I feel like I walked away with a few bruises, even though I enjoyed what I read of it tremendously.
I totally enjoyed it too. You know, we were a little apprehensive about this. We're like, there's so much to know here, not on so many levels. First of all, the English rendition that we were reading together, which we'll talk about in a moment, is necessarily a kind of adaptation or a selection of an enormously large work. So the version we read is only about, 1/12 of the scope of the entire work. And this one is like 850 pages, right? And beyond that, there's this incredibly rich history of commentary around it. And it's just so layered. There's like, it feels like it would take years and years and years to get to the bottom of this work.
Right. And this is the first time either of us have tackled it.
That's right.
I have to stop using the word tackled. But that's okay. But again, because it's an enormous work. It is 1.8 million words in total. It's like 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. It is really big.
Massive.
And it had a really long period of being authored, as I understand it. Which is to say, I guess there's a long and complicated tradition of the work. And over the course of several centuries, more and more tales got folded into it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I sort of think of it in terms of how we sometimes might say, oh, in Greek mythology, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as if there was a book called Greek mythology that the Greeks had handed down to us. I don't know if this is actually as all-inclusive as that, but it feels a bit like they've put a lot of the kinds of stories in the classical tradition that you have to look for in all sorts of different texts here and there, or only fragments or stories of stories. They're just all in here.
Mm-hmm. It's incredibly capacious, as you say. I think that's exactly right. So what we would call myth, if we're talking about Greco-Roman civilization, that's all in here. And one of the things I really hope we'll talk about together is the gods and what they're like here, because that's super interesting. But there's also, how can I put it? You were talking about this as a kind of a literary text, and it absolutely is that, with tales that are all interwoven. But it's also, and we just get a kind of a pale reflection of this in English translation, it's also verse, right? So there's a sort of formal quality to it as well that we can only appreciate in this very mediated way. And of course, also it's scripture, right? So in terms of Hindu practice, right, it's understood as sacred text, and therefore it engenders a certain kind of reading, devotional practice, and like I said before, an incredibly complex commentary tradition. So, I mean, we're reading these things as literature, but this is a work that's functioning on all these different levels.
Yeah, and I think it was written with several different levels in mind. Mm-hmm. I think also we don't tend to think about how Greek myths and Greek epics, how the Iliad functioned in a kind of religious context. Mm-hmm. Like we understand that as literature, but it is also telling stories of the gods that people believed in and, informed their sense of religiosity, and was told at major public events that had sometimes religious overtones. I mean, it wasn't religious in the sense that this is, or the sense that the Bible is, but like, these are big, capacious works that worked in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe one of the aspects that's operational here, too, is that we're accustomed sort of in contemporary culture to separating out like history over here, literature over here, religious writing over here. Like we understand them as being in separate kind of containers, right? And this work is absolutely comfortable in all of these environments. And so that's one of the things that's remarkable about it, and kind of dizzying, like not in a bad way, but it's incredibly rich.
I guess it partially reminds me that a lot of our texts, as I was just saying, are actually more capacious than we think of them. I mean, the Bible, the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible also contains literature and history and fable and, and wisdom collections and things like that. Like, they are also capacious in ways that we've become sort of familiar with and we don't think about necessarily unless we think about it a lot. I don't know. They may become second nature.
Come to think of it, we have never done, I don't think, anything from the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible or the Quran or anything like that, right? Even though I've taught those kinds of texts, and you have too, right? In sort of like literary tradition courses. But this would be our first time of doing something that's truly scriptural, even though what you say about the Iliad and the Odyssey is absolutely true. There's a kind of devotional quality there too.
Yeah. Well, I know that some people treat Middlemarch as a scriptural text, but the other thing I want to point out is that we keep doing this already. We keep referring to this in terms of Greek mythology in particular, but maybe also other scriptures that we, as in you and I, are more familiar with. And that's how we're going to have to think about this text, because that is what we're bringing to it.
That's where we are.
It's where we are, exactly. And yet, I do want to stress, that's not what this text is. It's not a new variation on Greek myth. It's its own thing.
That's right.
And it's unfortunate that we aren't able to approach it as its own thing. We can only see it through these lenses of things that we have studied and thought about and formed habits around much more. That hopefully doesn't change how much we enjoyed the text, what we got out of it. Of course, we're also going to get very different things out of it because we're coming at it from outside the culture, right? Like,
yeah,
we didn't grow up with these stories. We don't know who these characters are, who these people are in the tale. We know who Achilles is. We sort of grew up with stories of Hercules, but I did not grow up with stories of Arjuna, so I don't know who that is, and I'm encountering it cold, which no one in the culture who is reading this text would.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have a weird view of these characters, and we're not going to be as familiar with them. I spent a lot of time reading the parts that I read, wondering who I'm supposed to root for and what that means.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you made that point, that we're approaching it from where we are situated. And that's going to be look very different if we were to have an expert here who knows that text really well, or somebody who has grown up with it as part of their culture and has kind of internalized some of these narratives. I feel like, though, even though, at certain times when we read works together, one or the other of us has come from a position of deep familiarity with the text, and that's good and that's useful. But I feel like it's also useful for us to kind of model this process of, like, what is it to come to a text that is big and intimidating and challenging and beautiful, and sort of try to meet it in our limited kind of way, and then hopefully improve that, with somebody who's a little more expert. The other thing I was struck by was, I think it might have been in the introduction to the translation that we read, or it might have been in one of the other things that I was reading in preparation. But the person writing this introductory material made the comment that for people who grow up with a sort of culture where these stories are every day, like you were saying about Achilles, for people brought up with, sort of Western tradition stuff, that there's a kind of a familiarity every time you encounter one of these people, one of these figures, one of these characters. And I almost had a little glimmering of that at one point when I was reading through this, and had the sense that, a figure or a character will show up and then they'll be gone, and then they'll resurface, and then they're gone and then they resurface. And you get the sense of, like, almost like, I don't know, woven strands, right? And one pops up every now and then. And you can just imagine being in a cultural environment where, that's the experience, that they show up in all these different kinds of settings. And it's one story, but it's also many stories.
I mean, that was one of the things that I was feeling when I was reading it, was that lack, right? That sense that I should be knowing more about who these are. These should be resonant in that way. Yeah. Now, I feel like we're bringing all this up, both, maybe to cover our asses. I don't know.
To confess.
But mostly to let you know, listener, what you're getting in for, right? I don't want anybody to listen to this thinking that we're going to come down and have, like, the knowledge and about the Mahabharata. We will have a take as new readers who are used to other traditions. And that's what this is. It's a conversation. It's an excuse to expose ourselves to this terrific text but it's not in any way, shape, or form the final or even a vaguely authoritative word on it. So if you are randomly listening to this because you wanted to find out more about the Mahabharata, well,
we will link in the show notes to a podcast that will give you an expert account.
Exactly. There are perhaps better sources for in-depth understanding of this. And we will also be doing a bonus episode with somebody who knows more about this. So there'll be a little bit more of an explanation there. But we are what we are.
Yeah, we can give you a sense of what it's like to read if you're coming at it without that kind of knowledge base. And maybe that's useful too.
And also, I think we should say that of what I read, if we haven't said it already, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. I felt like it was like being like washed over like by, I don't know, like a tide or something. Like I was like full up with knowledge, and then you forget who's this person, who's that person. It was almost like, you know what I mean? Like being full of knowledge and empty of it over and over again. It was a very strange experience reading.
It was also just not doing anything I expected it to do.
Uh-huh.
And again, this comes from having a certain set of preconceived notions based on Greek myths and so forth that I've read. But these stories were wild in the best possible way.
Yeah. Yeah. Weird stuff happens.
Before we move on, I think we should mention just by name which version of it we're reading. Mm-hmm. We're looking at the translation that was done by Carol Satyamurthy. That came out a few years ago, I believe.
2015.
And as you said, like so many translations of the text, it's an adaptation. Mm-hmm. It doesn't include everything. It doesn't try to be everything, but it is definitely trying to give you the flavor and a way into the text. I think there is a complete English translation of the sort of scholarly definitive text, but it's quite old.
It's late 19th century by Ganguly. It's a prose translation, and it's very detailed. But I gather there's a new one underway that's only partway through right now. And we would never in a million years have been able to read the whole thing. So this is a good way for us to enter into it. And we looked at a couple different translations actually and trying to figure out what we should read. And I actually really liked this one. We had looked also at a translation by William Buck that got recommended to us. And what I discovered when I started going through that is that, every adapter, every translator has to make choices. Like you're going to leave stuff out, right? And he had left out like big chunks. And one of the things he had left out is a really important section of the text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is sort of inserted within the Mahabharata as almost like it's a separate work, but it's also a part of that work. And so I found it really difficult to navigate. And then when I started looking at this one by Satyamurthy, I mean, obviously she leaves a ton of stuff out, but she keeps the 18 book structure. Like she gives you some of every one of the 18 books. And I really liked that because that made me get kind of oriented in terms of the shape of the whole work. How about you? What was your experience?
I found this much more readable a text than the Buck translation. Although some of the stuff that I had read in both, Buck seemed to include a few details that Satyamurthy didn't, which is interesting. Like translators, especially translators who are doing this much adaptation, are going to pick out different details. But this is definitely a much more readable book, I think.
Yeah, and parts of it actually are really, I think, quite lovely. I mean, she's a very gifted poet in some ways, as we will show.
So let's do a little bit of an overview. I mean, what is the Mahabharata about?
Well, okay, my sense of it, and tell me if this is your sense of it, is that it's basically about an epic ongoing battle between two families, which are in a sense part of one family, right? So there's this very elaborate genealogy, very elaborate network. And I say network as well as genealogy because it's not just lineal descent. There's all kinds of weird crossings and strange kinds of configurations that are involved in this, in how lineage works in this family. But we end up with two sort of opposing factions, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And so these are sort of groups of warriors that are both part of the same overarching family structure, but they're sort of alienated factions from one another. And then there's this very intricately interwoven set of family relations, teachers, mentors. The gods become incarnate and mingle into these genealogies in all kinds of ways. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is it has teaching for how you might be as a person. So there's a kind of ethical or moral or religious content as well that's woven throughout, but then is also kind of clustered in this one encounter of Krishna and Arjuna, which is the Bhagavad Gita.
That seems like a pretty good summary.
Thank Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, from what I know, which is not much.
That was a baby summary.
It's an epic centered around a war, right?
That's right.
Much like the Iliad or some other ancient Greek stuff, again, to draw on that well again, I suppose. But this contains a lot more of people questioning themselves about what is the right path. How do you follow Dharma? And I don't know. Let's say I don't know anything about Dharma. I don't know anything about how that works. But my sense from what I read of the book is that it's both a sort of a code that you follow that is ordained by the gods, but also something that's really up for discussion and negotiation. It's not like precepts. It's happening based on precedent, I guess is the sense I got from it.
Yeah. Actually, one of the, we talked a lot about our ignorance and all the stuff we don't know. And like, gosh, there's a lot. But one of the things that I found really satisfying about this reading of the Mahabharata is that Dharma in particular is like a concept that I'd heard of many times. And I kind of knew what it was, but I feel like I understand it so much better now because this book doesn't just define it for you. It actually shows you what that looks like.
Yeah.
And again, it's in that encounter that we mentioned already, the Bhagavad Gita section, or the Gita, which is the song, right, of the gods. And it's an encounter of Krishna and Arjuna on the battlefield. So Arjuna is supposed to head out in the battlefield, like everything is really getting underway. We've been leading up to this battle between those two factions. It's going to happen. And before he goes out on the battlefield, Arjuna says to Krishna, who's acting as his charioteer, wheel me out there. I want to get a look at those guys. I want to look them in their eyes before we actually set out into battle. And Krishna, he takes him out there, and Arjuna looks and he sees, members of his family, like people he loves on the other side. And he's like, I totally cannot do this. He kind of freaks out. And then everything stops. And Krishna's like, whoa, you need to understand what you have to do here. You need to understand how everything works. Let's just take 5 minutes, and it's like almost like time opens up into like a whole nother room. And he gets all this teaching. And there's many things going on there, but one of them is what your Dharma is, which is kind of what you ought to do. Obligation, right behavior. For people who are familiar with Arabic terms, with regard to Islam, this idea of deen, which is like the things you are obliged to do, what you owe, is a little bit similar to that, or at least that was my point of connection. And I kind of helped me understand how Dharma is working here. But Krishna kind of shows you how it works. He doesn't just define the abstraction. It says this is what it means. And it means to do what's right for you as an individual, but it also means to do what's right based on who you are within the social order and your familial order. In other words, who you are isn't just about how you feel and like, this collection of subject positions that you or I are, right? But who you are relative to your family, your caste, your society, the people around you. That's what determines your Dharma.
And also sort of what's been ordained by the gods or the cosmos.
For sure.
So there are situations where the Dharma, following the Dharma, might involve things that on the surface seem like things you shouldn't do. But then, in fact, the gods need you to do this, or, but don't forget this story where such and such a god did this thing, and therefore showing that in this particular kind of instance, this is the right thing to do. That was the thing that I found really interesting about this, was this kind of, again, I don't want to quite say flexibility, but this, the sense that it's not as obvious as, let's say, obeying a commandment.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's complex, right? Part of it is obeying what is ordained, what is meant to happen, what the gods want you to do. That's all true. But it's kind of, I don't know what the word is, not situational exactly, but like,
it's interpretive.
Yeah.
It's like what you do with the text, right? You're analyzing the text. You're analyzing the stories that you know and the precedents that you've heard. And you're trying to determine, well, what are some of the general rules and how do they apply to my current situation? And the greater amount of these stories that you know, then the more likely you are to find something that will apply.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, this is again one of those moments, right, where it's a concept that, for you and me, I guess, right, it's very unfamiliar and really difficult to wrap your head around. And all the definitions in the world aren't going to help. It's only through reading a bunch of examples so that you're like, I kind of get a sense of how this might work. So that's really neat. And also, one of the things I was fascinated by is that Dharma shows up, in this way that we were describing just now, like what you must do and what you must not do. Like there's this one moment where Karna is told by his teacher, he's given some powers, and he says, "But remember," says his teacher, "you should only use these sacred powers in the service of Dharma. Death is the price of using them for any evil purpose," right? So that's that sense of Dharma we were talking about. And yet also there's this one moment, and this is quite early in the text, where Vidura is born, and he's said to be an incarnation of Dharma, god of virtue, who had been cursed to be born from a Shudra womb. Vidura would become known for loyalty and wisdom. So Dharma shows up also kind of as a god who becomes incarnate. And again, this is one of the aspects that I found super interesting, the ways in which they're gods, right? And they can become present in the world. For example, Ganga, who's the goddess of the river Ganges, right? She gives birth to a bunch of sons, which we might talk about. So that kind of stuff happens. But then also abstractions like Dharma become incarnate. And so this borderline between abstraction and deity, what we would separate out, in the text that we're familiar with, personification on the one hand and the gods over here, it seems like here they function almost within the same system.
Mm. Yeah, you also mentioned Krishna as one of the characters. And even as somebody who didn't know anything about this text, I'd know that Krishna is a god or of some sort. It's an avatar of Vishnu, one of the big gods, as I understand it.
That's right.
And he's just here. He's been born as a human, and he's participating, and he's a cousin to the Pandavas, and he's participating in all this. And it's just like, okay, all right. But all sorts of gods show up and are born and are sort of punished by being forced to be born.
Yeah. One of the things that is unbelievably interesting, I think, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is, this one section inside the text, is where Krishna actually talks about who he is, right? So he kind of makes it clear that he's a manifestation of Vishnu, but he talks about himself both in that immediate sense as Krishna, like as this instantiation of the god, currently in this moment here on the battlefield talking to Arjuna, but then also as this kind of eminent divinity that's sort of beyond the threshold of the text. So he says, "All that exists is suspended on me like jewels on a necklace. I am everywhere. I am the essence of everything that is. The cosmos is sustained by my energy. I am the deathless radiance of the sun, the heat of fire, the soft gleam of the moon. I am the taste in water, son of Kunti. I am Om, the sacred syllable. I am the roar of the wind, the manhood of men. I am the pure fragrance of the earth." And it goes on like a whole lot longer, but it's really beautiful. But there's this idea that Krishna is both of these things, right? Present in the world, like as the charioteer, related to the family, and also all of this other stuff out there. It's so cool. I love that.
So I didn't really get a chance to read the Gita. What else is it like? Like, what is it? How was it? Tell me about it.
I guess I found it really interesting because of the way it kind of brings together visionary experience with the brutal reality of the battlefield. You mentioned the Iliad earlier, right? And, that's a text we enjoyed a lot. I mean, that's the very first text we did together, you remember? Mm-hmm. Like all those ages ago, 2 years ago, almost exactly now, right? And the account of warfare in literature gives you a way to talk about a whole lot of other kinds of things. There are many things you can talk about through the language of warfare. And there's also a lot you can accomplish through the language of visionary literature. Like we talked about this when we read Dante, for example. But here, they absolutely come together. And I just found that so extraordinary. So that, they're on the battlefield. Like I said, Arjuna feels like he can't do it. Time freezes, right? And that's when the teaching begins. And Krishna is really patient. It's like, oh, you're just not understanding how this works. Everybody, he says, has their proper course, their dharma, the path of righteous action they should follow, depending on the station they occupy. Your dharma is to fight. That is your purpose. That is what you were born for, right? So there's this kind of fundamental teaching that's the beginning of what Krishna imparts. And he brings out, like, there's these two paths. You can act or not act, and it depends on the circumstances, which one of those things you should do. And then Krishna unfolds who he is, like in the way I was describing, as having this kind of immanent power, right, that he's channeling through in this present moment, but also in his sort of eternal nature. And it's a very different notion of eternity from what we've explored in some of the other books we've read. He says this about time. He says, "I have passed through many lives as you have, but I remember them and you do not." Right? So this is a crucial difference. "I am the changeless and eternal self, sufficient never born, never dying. Yet I take on a material form whenever the world is in need of me to protect the good and destroy evil. I have no personal need to act, and yet I act to set the world a right example. So, so this whole idea of like eternity and linear time, the divine and the human, the visionary and the battlefield, like it's that juxtaposition that I'm absolutely enchanted by.
Do the other characters come up in that discussion?
It seems to me like it's a very, very intimate exchange. It's like they're on the battlefield. So presumably there's a ton of people around them, right? But it's almost like they're alone in a private room. And in fact, that section ends with an emphasis on the secrecy of what they're doing. Krishna ends up, like he's been talking, he summarizes his teaching and he says, I've taught you this mystery of mysteries. He says, I am the love that fills the universe and you are my beloved Arjuna. Right? So it's very intimate. And he says, you must never repeat this sacred teaching to an audience unworthy of it. But whoever shares this supreme secret with the deserving shall surely be rewarded. That's pretty much, where they end. So again, it's the middle of the world. It's like this spectacle, right? It's a battlefield. Everybody's looking, right? And yet they're all by themselves with this secret. So it's a really neat moment.
That is neat. I guess I asked about the other people because there are several characters who are models of what to do or what not to do in terms of Dharma, including several of the brothers and the cousins that are fighting each other. And there's one character in particular who I was really intrigued by. And again, I didn't read the whole thing. I've looked up what happens to him later on. But I was really interested in Karna, who is this wild character. I mean, in many ways, literally wild, is one of those characters who's born of noble parentage, but it can't be talked about. So gets put into a basket on a river or something like that and sent away and is raised by foster parents and becomes a really fantastic archer, much like Arjuna, and tries to get taught by the same master teacher who teaches Arjuna and the other Pandavas, and is refused because he's not of noble enough heritage. Well, it turns out he is, but nobody knows this. And yet he keeps practicing on his own and he gets really like wild and intense about it to the point where he is clearly as good, if not maybe even better than Arjuna. And yet he's constantly being thwarted, right? He goes and shows off. And then, am I remembering correctly that the master tells him to cut off his hand?
Well, actually, so sort of, right? There is this like protracted, because I also was fascinated by this section. I found it really interesting. So there's this kind of competition between Arjuna and Karna. And nobody knows who Karna is, right? So they don't realize that they're both sons of the same mother, right? Of Kunti, because she had, as you say, put Karna in a basket and sent him down the river, where he was found by these foster parents. So Arjuna is this incredible skill at archery. And we see, I was only like half facetious when I was like making notes here. There's this like very like Jedi mind trick moment he has.
Yeah.
Do you remember this? Where he's so incredibly expert with the bow and arrow that he even runs out on a moonless night and lets the arrow fly even though the target is invisible.
Yep.
And it says it's actually kind of quite beautiful. Now he had understood what it means to aim, but without straining. He had a glimpse of how one may become a channel for the world's natural forces to play themselves out. How, without striving, without attachment to the end result, abandoning desire and memory, an arrow can be loosed and find its home. And it's such a neat image, right? And Dante actually has a kind of a similar image, but he's doing something very different with it. This idea that like, yeah, you're kind of shooting the arrow, but really what's happening is the arrow is doing it. Like you're not even doing it. You're just the mediator. You're just the channel.
There's another part where the line is, after he shoots a bow, not a thought had ruffled Arjuna's mind. He had simply acted.
Yeah. Oh, that is a great moment.
And it's just, oh.
Yeah. So anyway, there's this moment where there's another rival archer, a person called Ekalavya, and we only get a very, very short account of his story. This is around page 56 or so. He too wants to learn to be a great archer, and he asks Drona, who's the teacher who's taught Arjuna, to teach him as well. And he's like, no, you're not of the right caste for this. No, like get out of here. But nonetheless, the student is devoted to his teacher, and he practices and practices and practices. And people encounter him and they ask, who are you? And where could you have learned to shoot like that? The youth replied, "My name is Ekalavya. My father is the chief of the Nishadas, and I owe my skill to the great Drona, my master." Right? And it's not that Drona had taught him personally, but that he sort of idealized him as a teacher. So Drona talks to this person, right? This boy who has taught himself to be an archer, like inspired by the teacher, who's not actually physically present to him, except as a kind of an image he's made. And he says to the boy, "Ekalavya, if I am your teacher, you should now give me my fee." "Name it, anything," the boy cried, flooded with happiness that he had been acknowledged by his guru, by his teacher. "There's no gift I shall withhold from you." "Then," said Drona, "give me your right thumb." Ekalavya's smile did not falter. With an arrow's single downward slash, he sliced off his right thumb and placed it dripping at Drona's feet. Right? Now, this has to happen, right? We were talking about Dharma before, because Arjuna has to be the greatest archer in the world. So this has to happen. But it's just heartbreaking and awful, right? The two men stride away, and out of Ekalavya's small story. But we may imagine this. Ekalavya bound the throbbing socket of his thumb with herbs and soothing leaves, then sat in thought. Sunlight left the forest canopy, dusk came, then darkness. Still he sat alone. In the dawn light he rose and bathed, then stood in front of Drona's statue. In respect he touched its feet, then straightening he took his bow, began again to practice. Right. So it's almost like it's neat because it's this little nested in episode between the larger competition of the archers, Archana and Karna, and thinking about what it's doing there, I think is really interesting.
So I had thought that was the same character as Karna. And I realize now why I made this mistake, but maybe that changes a few things in terms of how I think about Karna, because we then immediately go into another chapter which begins, "Who was the extraordinary youth, the strong young eagle, child of nobodies who dared aspire to outclass Arjuna?" And we're talking about Karna. Mm-hmm. But because it immediately follows from that story, I've thought, the extraordinary youth is this youth who just cut off his thumb.
But I think we're meant to have that, confusion.
Quite possibly. This is one of those situations where I feel like my unfamiliarity with this text and this tradition means that I can easily make that kind of mistake.
Well, because what's being drawn to our attention in that opening chapter that you're just mentioning, right? It opens, who was this extraordinary youth, right? We're talking about Karna. Even as a child, he was a stranger in his own skin. The shining gold cuirass he was born with, the luminescent earrings seemed incongruous for a driver's son. And with his tawny eyes, the nobility of his demeanor, he looked so unlike his humble parents. To understand who Karna really was, we must now uncover Kunti's secret.
Yes.
Right? So it's about Dharma again, right? Like that boy that we were just talking about, Ekalavya, he's not of... how can I put it? His place in the world is not such that he can rival Arjuna. It's just not possible. But Karna, though, he's differently situated. And so his dharma is different, right? And so it is possible for him. And that discrepancy between how he seems and what he really is part of that.
So the reason we picked this text is because we're doing a cluster on sex. And you put this up as a possibility, and I trusted you, and I said, sure. And I thought, that seems like a weird pull, but okay. And having read the first book of this, which sets up all the characters and all their genealogies and all that stuff, oh boy, does this have some really interesting thoughts on sex.
Yes, I agree. How did it strike you?
I was surprised 3 ways to Sunday.
Well, I mean, it's doing all kinds of work, isn't it? All different kinds of work, I think.
Is there any major character who is born of a human man and a human woman who are married to each other? I can't think of any. I'm sure there's something, but most of it just seems like, well, there's a woman who's married, and then one day she gets a fancy for the sun, and so the sun god she accidentally brings down and they have a child. And or one day the guy walks away from his wife and goes out into the woods and falls in love with the river, and they have several kids, all of whom drown. They're just wild.
Well, yes, it is complex. So sometimes it is, as you say, the gods. So there's that, for example, where we mentioned this already, where Ganga, the goddess of the river, manifests herself as a woman, and then she bears 8 sons, and she drowns the first 7 because they're actually gods who, I forget exactly the reason, but they like needed to be reborn real quick and then get back out of this world so that they could, I don't know.
Something happened. They were being punished with mortality and they wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. So can we be drowned as babies was their request.
She's like, I'm on it. And then the last one, though, she leaves to be the heir of the person who has fathered them. And that's going to, be giving the Bharata dynasty, right? And then you mentioned, for example, the sun god, right? The secret that Kunti has is that she can summon the gods. She has this kind of power that she received as a child. And so at one point she calls on the sun god and that's how she gets the baby Karna. So sometimes there's like the gods coming into the world. And that's, we could compare that if we wanted to, with what we see in the Iliad, for example, where the gods father children on human beings, or in the Metamorphoses.
But it plays out completely differently.
Yeah, it plays out really. And then plus, this is where I was actually going with this. Plus, the way lineage works in families is super, super interesting because it's not like a regular sort of tree-like genealogical descent. It's like, my son's, dead and he has 2 widows. So, could you, son of like my husband, by another woman, possibly father some children on them and keep everything all in the family? It's like, I guess that's all sort of still in the family, but there's a ton of that kind of stuff going on.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah. No, that gets really complicated. Let's talk about having sex with gods first.
Okay.
And I think Kunti's a pretty good story for that. So she's just had her first period. Mm-hmm. And as it says, and felt ashamed that she was now a woman and yet unmarried, which, okay.
Okay.
You got a little time, in my opinion, but
evidently not.
Different cultures. And as the sun was rising over the distant hills, the mantra came to her mind, and at once Surya, the sun god in human form, blazed before her, the most beautiful creature she had ever seen. And naturally, she freaks out.
Well,
she's like, She cries out in terror, "Go back, my lord, back where you came from. I was only playing." And Surya is like, "Nope, you cannot call forth the god just to dismiss him."
Nope.
Mm-mm. And says, "I know your mind. You wish to lie with me and to bear a son who will be unrivaled in his prowess. Come now. If I simply take my leave and do not give you the son your heart desires, I shall be ridiculed by all the gods, and I shall curse you and your father too." So, okay. So she freaks out. She's sobbing because what are the consequences? I'm just a child, a virgin. The good name of my family will be ruined, which seems a little weird considering it's the sun god. You'd think that would be okay, but I don't know.
Well, I guess the idea is that who's going to believe you, right? Right.
I guess that's true. Although it's not like the kid doesn't come out with like golden radiant earrings in his ears or something.
Well, this is his reassurance, right? He's like, do not worry, right? First of all, I have the welfare of the world at heart, so I can't possibly have any bad intention toward you. Second, even after we have sex, you'll still be a virgin.
Yeah, because as we've learned elsewhere, sex with gods works a bit differently. It's not penetrative in the same way. It seems to involve different body parts or something. I don't know. They don't go into that much detail.
No.
But also the pregnancy happens and unfolds in a slightly different way.
And as you said, the child is also born with the golden armor and earrings that the god had, right? So, and that's the child that she then sends away on the river.
Yeah. And so she agrees to it. And like, this feels, okay, it's, from our perspective, it's a bit sketchy.
And it is by far not the weirdest example of how this works.
No, but my point is that like, even though it's a god going after a pubescent girl, there's still some sense of like, it's not quite as bad as when Zeus comes down and just takes a woman. It feels like there's some negotiation, there's some discussion. This is like, is it her desire? She's anxious about things. He tries to calm her down. There's like some discussion happening, which felt incredibly refreshing. And I think generally speaking, while some things are a bit like forced by fate, or there's definitely imbalances of power, it still feels like a much healthier, more like discussion and pleasure oriented approach to sexuality than I'm accustomed to in Greek myths.
Yeah. There's another beautiful example of that in the important character of Draupadi, who is a woman who ends up married to 5 husbands, 5 brothers, the 5 Pandavas. So the reason this happens is because we learn she was a woman who had wonderful self-discipline, and therefore the god Shiva decided to reward her. He said, "Choose a boon and I will grant it." "I want a virtuous husband," said the girl. And in her eagerness to be understood, she said it again and again. "Dear girl, you shall have your 5 husbands," said Shiva. "No, I only want one," she protested. "Well," says the god, "you asked 5 times, and 5 husbands you shall have when you've been reborn in another body." So Draupadi is, but she's the same person and not the same person. In other words, she's the reborn version of the woman who asked for the 5 husbands. And the reason we get this story is it's kind of a backstory. What's happened is Draupadi's just been introduced into the story, and Vyasa, who's the narrator and also sort of mythic composer of the whole Mahabharata, has popped in to say, "Oh, by the way, this is the backstory you need to know about Draupadi." He says to the Pandavas, "This is the backstory of, the person who's going to be the wife to all 5 of you."
Yeah.
So that's super different too, right?
Yeah, there's a sense of that where it's like, well, that's not what that girl quite wanted. She just repeated it 5 times because she was super excited. And then it's also a different incarnation. So she doesn't remember the fact that she tricked herself into this or got tricked into this.
Yeah, because as Krishna says, when he's talking to Arjuna, I remember all my lives. You've had all these, but you don't remember the other ones.
And yet, I don't think that Draupadi, again, I haven't read the whole thing, but I don't think she really has a problem ending up with 5 husbands. It weirdly works out for the most part.
Yeah, it's her dharma, right?
It is her dharma, but also she doesn't seem unhappy with that dharma. Which I don't know. I don't know in the traditions whether, you should be unhappy with your dharma, whether that's a state you can be in, but it seems to work out.
But no, so so sex works in very weird and interesting kinds of ways here. So lineage, as we were starting to say, sort of plays out in an odd kind of way where it's not sort of genealogical, sort of straightforward kind of descent. It's often very complicated kind of descent relations. And Draupadi and her 5 husbands is a good example of how odd the configurations can be. But there's also a beautiful example, which is the one we used for the cold open, the babies in jars.
Oh, yes. This is such a good
one
passage.
Of my favorite moments. I don't know what you thought of it.
It's great. It's so great.
So what happened? This is, again, one of those sort of like, oh, you should have said it more clearly if you wanted, this or that. Right? So in the same way that episode of the Draupadi, where she was like, oh, you said it 5 times, so you get 5 husbands. Sorry. Similarly, too, Vyasa has come to court. And he was exhausted and famished, and Gandhari had welcomed and cared for him. Vyasa was moved by her compassion and said, "You will be the mother of 100 strong, courageous sons." And so what happens then is her belly is swollen, she's pregnant, the months drag on. Her belly was hard and lifeless. Despairing, she decided she must act, grimacing with pain to rid herself of the intolerable load she carried. She struck her belly, pushed, strained, cried aloud, and gave birth to a monstrous mass of flesh, like a dense and glistening clot of blood. She wanted to throw this thing into the fire, but Vyasa's standing right there, and she says, "Is this the 100 sons you promised me?" Vyasa said, "I never lie." And then he tells her to have the jars filled with ghee. The pieces of the flesh are put in there. And that's what becomes the 100 sons, the Kauravas, who are going to be opposed to this other faction, the Pandavas. So this is a really important part of the origin story. And so it's going to be 100 sons and 1 daughter.
What
do you make of that?
I don't know what to make of it. It's so baffling and unexpected. All right, so she's been promised 100 sons. Mm-hmm. She gets pregnant. She has this. It never comes to term. It just keeps being there, keeps being painful, and so forth. It doesn't kick. It's hard and lifeless, and so she manages to push it out, and it's this big, disgusting mess. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh no, this is no problem. We'll just take it apart, put some ghee on it, put it in some jars. At one point, there was an extra bit left. And she's like, oh, like I wouldn't have minded a daughter. And he's like, okay. So that one's going to become a daughter. And you just wait in these jars, which are like, they're sort of glowing and it's very magical.
It's very odd.
And then, the babies are born in jars. And I don't know at all what to make of any of that. It's so weird. It's so bodily. And yet it feels, I don't want to say more plausible, but let's say it's more attached to the world than, and again, I'm going to go back to Greek mythology here, but then the story of the birth of Athena, say.
Yeah.
Being born from the head of Zeus or whatever, which, okay, that's weird and that's bodily,
Hmm. You remember the whole story, right? It's Metis is in the form of a fly and it's irritating Zeus, right? And then doesn't he like devour the fly and then he gets the headache?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, that sounds right.
So, I mean, I haven't looked at it for quite a while, but so there's a whole kind of narrative that underlies this like strange birth from the head kind of narrative. So, I mean, that is a good point of comparison, but this is different in some ways. I guess because it's not just organic, it's actually kind of, I don't want to say mechanical, that's the wrong word, but like, I don't know. It's like a chem lab, it's like there's jars of babies.
Yeah. And it's sort of, it feels related to normal pregnancy in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like there is a growth in a stomach or whatever inside a woman that gets birthed out and then is attended to in a way that allows it to sort of incubate a bit further. It's some weird combination between the pregnancy and like a tumor.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's strange because, we're talking about this in connection with sort of sex and sexuality, right? Because it seems to be like sex shows up here in at least two and maybe more than two ways. One has to do with lineage and procreation and the family structures and, the movement of the Bharata family through time, right? We talked about that already a little bit and how complex that is. And the gods sort of flow in and out of those genealogies at different moments. But then it also shows up in this odd way that has to do with pleasure, but also to do with, I don't know, like what is accidental as opposed to what is intentional, right? So a lot of these genealogies are very like kind of intentional, right? For example, where Vyasa says, you're going to have 100 sons and then the whole business with the jars happens. Or, you asked for a good husband 5 times, so you're getting 5 husbands and that lineage emerges. Like there's an intentionality kind of to it. There's also a couple of passages here and there that have this odd like sex and sexuality and the reproduction that comes from it seem to be almost like accidental or I don't know, coming out of nowhere. One example is of the 2 children, Kripa and Kripi, a boy and a girl. There's a sage who has a son called Sharadvat, and he's a Brahmin, and he's out there. And one day he's walking in the forest carrying a bow and arrows, and he sees a beautiful girl. And then it says, a profound shudder shook him, and he spilled his seed, although he did not notice it. He turned and walked away. The seed fell on a reed stalk, and as it fell, it split. From the 2 halves, a boy and a girl were born. So this is really weird in 2 ways. Like one is, I don't know how you don't notice that, but okay. Going to bracket that. And then there's this beautiful kind of symmetry. It falls on this foliage, right? The reed stalk, and the seed splits and the 2 halves give a boy and a girl. So there's almost this weird kind of like symmetry or almost like, I don't know, microcosm like kind of quality to it. And then there's another example that happens like just a little bit later, just a couple pages later. And it explicitly compares it to the birth of Kripa and his sister Kripi. Like Kripa's, Drona's birth had been unusual. And we saw Drona already. He's this teacher who teaches archery, right? To Archana as well as to others. Like Kripa's, Drona's birth had been unusual. The great seer Bharadvaja once caught sight of a lovely apsaras, that's like a cloud or water spirit, fresh from her bath. A breeze parted her skirt, and the seer's seed gushed forth spontaneously. Bharadvaja placed it in a pot, and in due time, Drona was born, his name meaning pot. And it's weird, right? Because it's again this kind of like, okay, spontaneous, at least he notices it, Anyway, but he puts it in a pot and then there's this birth, right? So a little bit like the lump of flesh and the 100 sons. There's this sense that, you grow offspring almost like you grow plants, like there's this kind of porosity between the different parts of the natural world. That like I like is unfamiliar to me, and it's just kind of incredibly enchanting, right? So sex is like, how can I put it? It's interwoven with all kinds of natural reproduction in the world that in a way that feels very different.
Well, that's just a taste of a few of the exciting things in one part or 2 parts of the Mahabharata. It's, like I said, real good and real interesting. And I can totally understand why people find this text and get really into it.
Yeah, it's very, I want to say intoxicating. That's the wrong word. Like dizzying, but not in a bad way. I found like every time I would sit down to read it, I'd be like, I'd get up and I'd be like, wow, that was a lot.
Yeah. I had this weird mix of like a bit of dread, just like when I would approach it, but then I'd walk away very satisfied with what I had just read and, curious about more and just wishing I already knew it, so to speak.
Yeah, that it was familiar. Because that I think that takes time. I definitely want to come back to it.
And I think of this as a text that Westerners discover and then sometimes fall into and get really engaged with it. In fact, some of the translators, Buck, for example, who did that other translation that we looked at briefly, seems to have been one of these Westerners who didn't know this text at all, discovered it at some point, and then spent the rest of his life working on it. It's like, okay.
Yeah, it seems to have this quality that really just captivates people. I mean, in part, and I don't know a huge amount about this, just a little bit, but in part, it seems to be part of a kind of an engagement with Sanskrit literature and the culture of India more broadly that became a thing in North America and in Britain, I think. I don't know how much more widely in the Western world, but at least in those places in the 19th and earlier part of the 20th century, like that was kind of going on. But as you say, on the level of the individual people, it seems to have had this kind of captivating effect. Like they fall in love with it and then they stay with it. One example that I was really struck by, and I knew about this a long time ago, and I was just really fascinated to read into it a little bit more deeply, is J. Robert Oppenheimer's interest in the Mahabharata and in Sanskrit literature in general, but in the Bhagavad Gita in particular, the part that I also found really moving and really beautiful. And I think probably, were you already familiar with this, like with his interest in that literature?
I knew a little bit about it, but I don't know that much. So Oppenheimer, one of the people behind the nuclear bomb.
Yeah, he was basically running the Manhattan Project. Like he was running the sort of testing facility for this out in Los Alamos, right? So in the waning years of World War II, getting ready to build the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? So he was interested in Sanskrit literature from very early in life. And in fact, as a young man, when he was had his job out in the West Coast, out in Berkeley, he actually learned Sanskrit because he really wanted to engage with, this text in particular in more detail. And he always had apparently a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. I've been trying to figure out which one it is exactly that he had, but apparently always had one by him, and he used to give it away to people sometimes as a gift. So clearly meant a lot to him, right? And there's this very moving little video clip that easy to find, and we can put it in the show notes. And it's him being interviewed some years after the end of World War II, after the bombings. And he's talking about the first nuclear test and how they're, obviously these guys had all been working on the bomb. They really wanted it to work. But I think, at least in the case of Oppenheimer, he was also really aware of what this meant, that there was terrible consequences that were going to come from it. And so in that clip, he talks about watching what he saw and being reminded of the moment in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says this, and this is in Satyamurti's translation, it's a little bit different from the words Oppenheimer uses. I am time, destroyer of worlds. Even before you act, all these warriors, rank upon rank in the opposing armies, are already dead. I have destroyed them. From the perspective of eternal time, the everlasting present, those men you see lined up, eager for battle, full of the vigor of their youth and strength, are dead already. The bodies which have known cold and heat, pleasure and suffering already carry death and decomposition in their bones. The Pandavas will be victorious. Now rise up, hero. Be my instrument. Now, Oppenheimer only quotes that first line, I am time, the destroyer of worlds. And then he kind of pauses. He knows that whole passage.
Yes.
Right? And so if you understand, if you have a sense of that part of the book, you get a sense of what's going on there. It's how do you make sense of being in the position of somebody who's done a lot to instrumentalize this terrible, terrible destruction, right? These people, right, in Japan, presumably, right, he knows they're already dead.
Right.
Right? And this is how he makes it make sense to himself, right? And presumably through thinking about Dharma, he is who he is. Same way these guys who are warriors, that's who they are, right? That's what Arjuna is. He is what he is. Krishna says that's what you do, right? That's your Dharma. And Oppenheimer presumably understands himself not to be a warrior, but a scientist, right? And that's what he's there to do. But that doesn't make it all any less awful.
It's interesting to think about how that famous incident and that famous quotation of the Bhagavad Gita has to resonate when you're doing a translation later, right? So when Carol Satyamurti did this translation, was she thinking of how do I deal with this notorious usage of this text? Because she does change.
Well, she puts it as time. And actually, this is like one of these cruxes in the translation. When Oppenheimer gives the line, he says, I am death, destroyer of worlds. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. And as I started reading about it, apparently you can translate it kind of either way, right? The idea of death as a cutting off and time as a kind of marking a turning point, right? So apparently it's a translator's crux. It's one of those moments where you can kind of do it either way. And the choice you make is very revealing.
Right. I mean, for Oppenheimer's purposes, death makes more sense.
Well, but Krishna's talking about death too, right?
Oh, sure.
Destroyer of worlds. These men are already dead.
But yeah, but in that context, time is maybe just because it's fresher for me, but it becomes a more compelling thing, like time itself as a destroyer of worlds.
Well, we have this, this is, in fact, what we're going to read next time, one of the things we read next time is going to bring this out. The idea of, tempus edax rerum, time, the devourer of everything, right? We're going to be reading, Marvell, right? And Donne. And that shows up, that idea, right? So this idea of time as a destroyer, for some reason, follows close on the heels of, writers that are writing about sex, which is interesting.
Well, I guess we found our hidden theme because it came up in Delaney as well, didn't it?
This always happens to us, right? There's one theme we think we're talking about. It turns out there's this other one.
Well, great. Our happy ending to 2020, which was all going to be fun and about sex
and death,
has turned out to be about time, the destroyer of worlds.
Happy 2020, man. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on your way out.
All right. Well, next time around, we're going to be looking at some metaphysical poetry.
Some of my favorite stuff, actually. I'm very excited about that.
I am too. We've picked out a selection of poems, especially by Marvell and by Donne. I'm going to make a little PDF, which I'll make available for you to download if you want to read along. It's not going to be a tremendous number of poems, just the really good ones. and yeah, I promise we're lining up a bonus episode for this with somebody who knows the text much better than we do and can tell us all the ways we were wrong.
Yeah, but that'll be good. I'm really excited about that.
And show out all sorts of cool things maybe from other parts of the book. We'll see. I'm looking forward to that. But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/38. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.